Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I'm here with Bernard Lane, who I'm very excited to speak to. He is a journalist who covers the international debate about transgender ideology, specifically medicalized gender change for minors. So, this is an issue that's obviously highly contentious. It gets people canceled, fired, coming under fire from all directions. So, first of all, thank you so much for joining me, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you today.
Thanks, Sasha. I look forward to it.
Great. So, just to start off with, how did you first get into this issue? When did you first get wind of something wrong in the gender world? I'm
Yes.
curious.
Well, my first introduction was to trans activist campaigns because back in 2019, an editor at my newspaper, which at the time was the Australian newspaper, it's a national daily, an editor asked me to look at a story where the Australian comedian Barry Humphries was being cancelled. There was a comedy festival in the city of Melbourne, and the top award for a comedian was known as a Barry Award. And Barry Humphries had made some remarks about gender medicine. I think he used terms such as mutilation. And so he used strong language to criticise gender medicine. And there was an attempt by various activists and comedians to remove his name from the Comedy Award, which did happen. And so that was my first exposure to trans activist campaigns. And I sensed that there was something different here. And then the next thing that happened was that I was tipped off to an attempt to cancel a promising young philosopher who was going to present at the country's main philosophy conference on um, preserving women's single-sex spaces. And I had a look at her, excuse me, I had a look at her paper or the abstract from her paper, and, it was clearly a philosophical argument, and it was, it was reasoned, and you could agree with or disagree with it, but it staggered me that there was going to be an attempt to prevent her from actually putting this argument at a philosophy conference. And that turned out to be Holly Lawford Smith, who is the political philosopher at the University of Melbourne. So that was another exposure to trans activist campaigns. And then I'm not sure how exactly it happened, but I was put in touch with a handful of people, researchers, activists, some clinicians who were worried about the gender medical treatments with minors. And that's when I started to become quite alarmed because I could see that even if the answers were not clear, questions of raising concerns were clearly totally legitimate. But I found that when I reported those concerns, there was a tremendous emotive and abusive pushback on social media and more generally. And some of that pushback was coming from journalists who had taken up activist positions and who found it completely unacceptable to question the safety or the evidence for these medical treatments for minors. So that would have been around the middle part of 2019. And so I wrote about this issue for the Australian newspaper until late in 2021, I think, when I was on the receiving end of a complaint to a complaint handling body. And it seemed to me that that body had lost its objectivity, had adopted an activist position. So I decided that I was no longer going to write on that topic because, in effect, the work was being smeared or doubt was being cast over it, not just on my work, but my contacts, people who were taking risks to speak honestly and in good faith were by implication being smeared. And so, in a kind of a messy process, I wound up at the newspaper and I started writing on Substack, and I'm still going.
So you had this interesting experience of seeing the cancellations occurring, the smearings, and then it started to come back onto you. By the way, what were you writing about before you started covering gender? What was your beat then?
Well, I had worked for the Australian newspaper for almost 30 years, so I'd written about all sorts of different things. I'd written about legal subjects, cultural, architecture, environmental. Um, they're the ones that immediately occur to me. But you tend to stray from one area to another. I wasn't any particular specialist over a long period of time, but well, this has ended up being my focus. But I didn't set out to do this.
Right. So at what point did it become your focus? I mean, you saw this comedian and then this philosopher, academic being sort of attempted to be canceled, and you wrote about it. And did you get a lot of backlash to those articles at the time?
No, there wasn't much backlash to those articles. The backlash really came with the focus on these gender clinics in public children's hospitals in Australia. That's where the backlash was really quite extraordinary. I mean, the claim being made online was that I was driving trans kids to suicide, and that I was enacting some sort of right-wing Christian conservative campaign. The Australian newspaper is part of the Rupert Murdoch empire, and so it was being suggested that this was some kind of concocted Murdoch culture war, when in fact the only direction I had from an editor was to look at the original Barry Humphries story, and it was my own decision to pursue the story about youth gender medicine. Of course, it was discussed with editors, and editors, as usual, wanted to be reassured that um, the procedure of reporting was being followed properly, that the gender clinic people were being given opportunities to comment, etc., and all that was being done. But um, there was no campaign really. It was just my becoming aware that this was a live debate. I mean, at that point in 2019, it had been a live debate for at least a year or so in the UK, and I saw that in the UK, some of the critical reporting of gender clinics was coming from the BBC. So it wasn't simply coming from media outlets that could be characterised as right-wing or centre-right. And I could see also that the nature of the coverage in the UK was not inflammatory, it was engaging with the details of the story, with the nature of the procedures, the question of the evidence supporting them, the risks, that kind of thing. But there's no doubt it's the issue of so-called trans kids in inverted commas, and these medical treatments which generates a lot of heat.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very disturbing, first of all, that people would accuse you of wanting trans kids to die. But that's exactly what gets thrown around in this debate, in this topic. I was just telling a friend today that um, I've been called a Nazi for opposing gender transition for kids because this friend, she has no idea, what's going on in this world. And she's like, how is that possible? Also, this is a Jewish friend and myself being Jewish as well, which increases the irony, of course. But yeah, it's that backlash really does indicate something very sinister, something very wrong occurring, right? Because as you said, the coverage was very fair-minded, scientific, looking for the evidence, looking for, what is going on here with gender medicine for kids, which really, if you're an advocate of that type of treatment for kids, you should want scrutiny, right? You should want journalists to look into this. You shouldn't want it to just sort of be brushed under the rug. You would think if they were in good faith, right, that they would encourage more careful reporting on this.
Yes, it's hard to know how much of it is ignorance because the media coverage has been so poor, or how much of it is ideological capture. I mean, I've come to believe that part of the great sensitivity on this issue of youth gender medicine derives from the nature of youth gender medicine, which is that it's not like any other aspect of medicine. It's a sort of a hybrid between identity politics and medical technologies. And I think that at some level, some of the activists and clinicians are aware that if they have to try to defend gender medicine on strictly medical or scientific grounds, they can't do it. And so whenever there's scrutiny of the evidence base and normal questions about risks and benefits for medical intervention, the identity politics card is used to trump that conversation. And terms such as, you're debating my existence. You literally want trans people to disappear. You want trans genocide. So there's this inability to engage with, as you say, questions that are really important for the kids undergoing these treatments and their families. I mean, do they really have a sound expectation of a good outcome or not? But that issue gets obscured because of the politicised narrative.
Yeah, that it absolutely gets obscured, and to the point where, parents are being told that they have to transition their kid if they want their kid to have any chance at even avoiding suicide, which is this sort of emotional blackmail. In your experience, have you seen that a lot with parents being told that? Have you seen parents who are really gung-ho about transitioning their kids, or kind of a mixture of both?
Yes. I've had some contact with parents who believe that the medical interventions were life-saving, and who were very angry with my coverage. But it's actually quite unusual for those people to engage with a skeptical journalist. There was one woman who did ring up, and we had some conversations, and I tried to persuade her to do an interview with me, but in the end she refused. But the normal reaction of the parents who have gone along with medical transition of their children is extreme hostility and a refusal to engage with someone like me, with a skeptical journalist. And potentially they're responsible for some of the anonymous complaints that come my way. But I've certainly also spoken to parents who were skeptical about the medical interventions being proposed for their children, and they were told that if they didn't go down the medical path, there was a very high likelihood that their child would attempt suicide. And that slogan, would you rather a dead daughter or a live trans son, it's remarkable. It turns up everywhere. I think parents have heard it in most developed countries. I'm not sure where that it originally comes from, but it does get recycled. And so I think that along with poor media coverage, the suicide narrative is one of the most important factors in the derailing of a normal discussion about this, because if the suicide, this dramatically exaggerated suicide threat was removed, then people would look at the risks and benefits of these medical interventions in quite a different way. I mean, the balance would tip um, much more in the direction of risk. And parents and possibly some of the kids would decide not to go down the medical route. But it's an amazingly resilient narrative, the suicide narrative. When you look at the studies that are quoted to justify it, they are extremely low quality, typically online, anonymous, advocacy-driven, and the studies that are a bit more compelling, for example, the study of actual suicides at the Tavistock Clinic in London, I think the figure was 4 suicides over a lengthy period of time, many, many thousands of kids. 4 is, you could say 4 is too many, but it's certainly nowhere near the rate that you would expect given the suicide narrative. And the view of experienced clinicians seems to be that trans-identified kids diagnosed with gender dysphoria probably do have an elevated risk of suicide, but it's probably, that's when compared to the general population, but it's probably comparable to the elevated risk that you would see in kids who are in contact with child and adolescent mental health services, kids with depression or autism or eating disorders. And because a lot of these kids in gender clinics have those conditions, it's not clear to what extent gender dysphoria itself is creating an elevated suicide risk.
Right. And then there's also the aspect of that suicide itself is a social contagion, right? So the more the activists kind of spread this idea that if you are not affirmed, if your so-called life-saving healthcare is taken away, that your risk of suicide goes up, that's highly irresponsible, at best.
Yes.
And as a journalist, I mean, I'm sure, follow certain guidelines about reporting on suicide. And what is it like to see these other journalists or activists or organizations just kind of throw that all out the window and just write things like, oh, people who oppose childhood transition are killing trans kids. And the only thing they're referring to there, again, is the suicide. Because it's not actually life-saving healthcare in the sense that your body needs it to continue to live, right? It's about that their claim that they need it for their mental health.
Yes. I mean, I sometimes think of it as the trans exception. The normal rules, the normal values, the normal considerations just don't apply. Why? Because it's the trans exception. And I mean, as you say, there's pretty settled mental health advice that's given to people in the media and also to clinicians who are talking about suicide, not to oversimplify the causes of suicide, not to give a sort of a catastrophizing view of it, not to emphasize the particular vulnerability of certain groups. And those rules are just totally ignored when it comes to trans kids and gender dysphoria. And it's not just the journalists who are, in some cases, ignoring them. It's the clinicians, mental health professionals, some of them. So that is extraordinary. And it's also potentially a factor in the way in which these activist online surveys of suicide risk reliably come up with alarming figures, because this is a group of kids who are constantly being told that they are uniquely suicidal. So it's extraordinary that there aren't more suicides. You know, as far as we're aware, there are not suicides in significant numbers involving gender dysphoria. But there's a recklessness, and it's unethical too. I think it's unethical the way in which suicide and trans is being discussed. It's not helpful to the kids themselves. You with kids like that who have lots of problems, you would want to be encouraging their resilience, and telling them that there is hope, because otherwise you just compound the problem.
Right. Right. When I was in high school, the messaging towards kids who were struggling with depression or their sexual orientation was, it gets better. That was the slogan, it gets better.
Yeah.
So, like you said, this encouragement and this call to resilience, and not this actual pressure that it will not get better without some kind of medical intervention and without other people around you changing the way they perceive you, the way they speak about you and to you. It's a very pessimistic message for those kids, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And I mean, there are clinicians who also make the point that um, the very process um, which gender medicine seems to regard almost as an illness, puberty, that process of development and maturation may be necessary to the natural cure of gender distress. And phrase that you use, it gets better, because it seems that, according to clinicians, that there are problems and issues that tend to resolve or get better as the young person grows up and develops through puberty. But now, because there's the possibility of drugs to put an unwanted puberty on hold, then these kids who have been raised as in opposite sex roles or as non-binary, they tend to approach the onset of puberty with fear, and it's difficult to see how that situation is changed as long as puberty blockers are available.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point because, a lot of kids have a fear of growing up, going through puberty, going through all these changes, and to introduce to them this idea that it's a choice almost, or it's something that you have control over. Like you said, they have to make this choice, and now you've put this massive burden on their shoulders instead of teaching them, like, this is something in life that we don't have control over. This is something we have to accept, and it's okay. It's going to be okay. It's
Yeah.
going to get better. They're saying, like, well, you get to choose whether you want to bear the burden of life, reality, the way, nature
Yes.
intended for it to be.
Yes. I mean, I've seen activists refer to puberty as the wrong puberty with irreversible effects. So they're likening it to an irreversible and harmful medical intervention.
Yeah, it's basically a reversal, right? Because that's actually what transgender medicine, in quotes, is doing. It Puberty itself, how can it be wrong? It's a natural process that humans have always gone through. But it's a way of firing back at the critics, right? Because they'll
Yes.
say that they'll try to turn it on its head. Oh, you say that puberty blockers are interrupting the correct processes. Well, so is puberty. And it's such a bizarre outlook that they've arrived at, that they think our bodies can just be altered and changed like that. And then it brings us to the topic of the surgeries, right? Which is really, really disturbing as well. I was recently reading about vaginoplasties being done on minors in the US. So for people who don't know, that is a penile inversion surgery, and it's done on a male who wishes to transition to, being a trans woman. And surgeons are out here telling men that they will become a woman, that if they want to, they can have sex with a straight man, and that they will be able to turn their genitalia from the male into the female. It's all a lie. And I've spoken to people who've gone through the surgery, but I have not spoken to any minors who've gone through this. That's still not a huge thing in the media yet. It's kept pretty under wraps. Even the surgeons who admitted they did this stayed anonymous. But do you know if that's happening in Australia as well, in terms of the sort of what they call the bottom surgeries on minors?
Mm. Um, I suspect it's not happening, or happening on a very rare basis. But I mean, as soon as I say that, I realise we don't really have the data, and getting the data is very difficult, because it can be disguised, in order to receive public funding. It's not listed as vaginoplasty, for example. I still think it's quite a radical procedure to be carried out on a young person, even young adults, because we're told that the adolescent brain is still developing until at least around age 25. And the legal age as a dividing line is somewhat artificial, because one of the concerns about gender medicine is the so-called cascade of interventions, that one intervention tends to lead to another, creating a lifelong pathway of medicalisation. So it would be interesting to know how minors understand medical transition if they were socially transitioned before puberty, sometimes at a very young age, and being so young, they may come to believe that they are literally the opposite sex. And then their puberty is put on hold. They go onto cross-sex hormones, and as a young adult, they have surgery. In theory, that's a legal adult consenting to the surgery. But is there a big question mark over it? Because arguably, the minor got locked into this ultimately medical path at the point of social transition. And then there's the other unknown, which is the potential effect of puberty blockers on cognition and decision-making. That's just an unknown. So is it the case that the young adult who we are told consents to bottom surgery really has an impaired ability to give informed consent? I don't know.
That's a really interesting point, that it could be that the puberty blockers themselves impair some kind of cognitive ability for them to later make this decision, even as an adult. I was interviewing Stephanie Davies Arai, who is a British expert on communication with children and parents, and she said that there was a study done on sheep in the UK with puberty blockers. Maybe you're familiar with this.
Yes.
And they showed that the sheep did have some who were on puberty blockers at the stage that the children are put on puberty blockers. And apparently sheep are somehow similar to humans in the way they go through puberty.
Yes.
that they had an impairment in some kind of spatial awareness. So that's
Yes,
quite concerning.
yes. I mean, in 2020, there was a very worrying paper that was published with many, many authors, including prominent US gender clinicians. And the nature of the paper was to try, they had a process whereby they drew on multidisciplinary expertise in order to try to list all of the unanswered questions about the potential effects of puberty blockers on the brain and cognition. And when you read that paper, you get the sense that there is a vast amount of research that would need to be done over many, many years with very big groups of subjects in order to answer these questions about the unknown effects of puberty blockers on the brain. And I mean, the remarkable thing is that we've suddenly found ourselves with these treatments being given as routine first-line treatments, whereas arguably they are experimental and can only be given ethically within the context of controlled clinical trials. And in the UK now, that seems to be the plan, that you almost nobody will get puberty blockers unless it's within a clinical trial. But this is a very strange inversion because, as I understand it, we say cancer treatments for kids. New treatments have to go through proper controlled clinical trials before they become routine. Whereas with gender medicine, it seems that we've had the routine treatments first and clinical trials are coming afterwards.
Yeah, it's scary because it's kind of like they're using the kids as guinea pigs, right? And there's a lot we might not know for decades to come.
Yes, that's right. And there's among the people who are worried about gender medicine, there's a division of opinion what to do about puberty blockers. Some argue that it's sufficient to limit them to clinical trials. Others say they should never be available, that they're just inherently unethical. I don't know what I think about that, but I suppose um, I suspect there's a. I was going to try to speculate about which position is more popular, but I really just don't know. I don't know. I mean, I do see both positions expressed pretty vigorously. Um, and I don't think there's even a suggestion in the US of clinical trials. The gender clinicians were given a very large amount of money to conduct longitudinal research involving a number of major clinics in the US, and they've reported some results which are kind of messy and not convincing about benefits and raise all sorts of questions about methodology. But that study doesn't involve any comparison between the gender-affirming treatments and some kind of non-invasive alternative. I'm not aware of any proposals for clinical trials in Canada or in Australia. I think there is a proposal in Sweden for clinical trials, but that's unconfirmed. I don't know what's going to happen really.
Yeah. It's quite interesting seeing, especially being here in the US, where we're just kind of going full steam ahead with gender transition for children, whereas in other parts of the world, as you said, like in the UK, they're kind of ramping things down. Scandinavia, I think they're slowing things down as well. But I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about yourself and just maybe some of the attacks that you might have weathered for standing up for this, and what has kind of caused you to want to continue to report on it, even despite all the vitriol that can come your way for covering it.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes I do wish that I could just walk away from it.
Mm.
Um, I really haven't had um, that much abuse. And I mean, the initial online abuse, and there were some um, probably not very serious death threats. But the thing that struck me is that the people, including the journalists who were telling me that my writing was going to kill trans kids, when I kept writing, they just gave up. They stopped saying it. And I thought, well, that shows that they don't believe it themselves. Because if they really believed that my writing was killing trans kids, they wouldn't give up. I think I mentioned that there were complaints against me to a regulatory industry self-regulatory body for newspapers. And I did find that very stressful, partly because it just seemed to me that those complaints had no foundation. They were partly upheld, and my main concern was that it cast doubt on the reporting. That if so how it happened is that if a complaint is partly upheld or upheld, a kind of a digital banner goes across the top of an article, but the nature of the ruling was such that even if someone followed the link and read the ruling, I don't think you would be able to work out what was supposedly wrong in the articles, apart from one actual issue which the ruling got wrong, in my opinion. But I think the effect of it, and this is probably true of misuse of most complaint procedures, is that it just casts a pall of uncertainty and doubt over material. And in those articles, there were many different sources. So I'm just glad that there was the alternative of Substack. I think that partly the story has its own momentum. There's so much to be written about. There's so much happening. So it is compelling in a way. The subject matter is sometimes quite distressing. But I mean, I don't have any personal stake in this. I don't have any family members affected by it. I don't have any ideological involvement, really. I don't think of myself as gender critical, for example. I think part of what drives me is disgust at the lies. There's a lot of lying going on, and corruption of institutions, corruption of normal standards and norms. It's quite extraordinary. And I think that, as I was saying before, I think that the failure of media reporting is a very large part of the problem. Because if, for example, we now have groups like GenSpect or SEGM representing partly clinicians who are worried about this gender medicine. If those groups approach clinicians they know are worried, but who are still expressing their concerns privately, apprehensive clinicians know that if they do go public, the likelihood of them being smeared in mainstream media is quite high, depending on the country. So I think there's a job to do in correcting the past failures of journalism, because for years, I suppose it's especially around 2012, since 2012, 2015 seems to be when the great international trans and gender medical campaign was really taking off. And the media coverage at that time was quite uncritically positive. It focused on human interest stories. You've got these engaging, articulate trans kids talking about how, how wonderful it's been to go through transition, how bleak their lives were before. And so the media coverage was superficial, uncritically positive. It didn't, those sort of personal stories are fine. They're a necessary part of reporting. But other work needed to be done looking at the claims that were being made by gender clinicians and by trans activists and checking those claims against reality and against the evidence base. And it seems that that was hardly done at all. I'm sure there were some isolated instances, but there's very little of that. And there has to be a lot more.
Yeah. And it's such a good point you make about how then they'll take an article like yours, which is using evidence, and put this banner on it that says, this might be faulty information, and it's really not. But the fact that they put that out there casts doubt upon it to viewers. It reminds me of when Lisa Litman put forth her article about rapid onset gender dysphoria, and she observed how, for people who don't know, who are listening, whole groups of girls were now suddenly identifying as trans, which was completely unprecedented, completely bizarre. And her paper was published by PLOS ONE, and that, which is a very reputable online journal, and then they retracted it, and they ended up reissuing it, I think, with some kind of a statement, like, this is controversial or something like that. This is unproven, but they hadn't actually shown anything she said to be wrong. But then for her detractors, ever since then, they can always point to that and say, it was retracted. It was, I guess that's kind of the nature of cancel culture, is they can kind of put people into this camp of do not listen to them.
Yes. Yeah, that was an extraordinary episode because it was part of it involved a straw man. So, and you'll still hear this, that Lisa Litman's study has been debunked, that rapid onset gender dysphoria is not a recognised diagnosis, and that her study was flawed because it had a biased sample. When you read the original study, you see that Litman was not claiming that ROGD was a diagnosis. She was saying this is preliminary research and ROGD is a hypothesis, and what Litman found was sufficient to say it warrants more research. And as for the sampling, she acknowledged in the original paper that she was relying heavily on parent groups where the parents were worried by this sudden declaration of trans by their children. So she was totally upfront about that. And when you look at lots of the pro-gender affirming research, most of which is very low quality, there are many examples where they have relied on biased parent groups. For example, parents supportive of transition. And the correction that PLOS ONE issued was described by one psychologist as, unprecedented because it was a non-correction. It didn't really correct any of the findings of the study. It simply took her own, she had hedged her findings in the original study. It took those hedgings and bumped them up in type size, you could say. There's a very good article about this by, I think it's Lee Jussim, who's a professor of psychology at Rutgers University, and he wrote about this for Psychology Today, about this bad faith correction.
Yeah. Um, and you mentioned also that it was the lies that, were being told that made you want to speak out against it. And I mean, I'm curious, have you had any social repercussions personally for speaking out against those lies? Because it puts people in
Well,
such a position of danger at times.
yeah, it it can be awkward because in my sort of social network, there are people um, whose kids, various stages of declaring a trans identity and or moving towards medicalisation, and so I just have to be careful what I say, I suppose. Um, I'm trying to think if it's cost me friends. I don't think so, but I live a bit of an isolated life, you know. Um, I think that I think that there are many more strangers who disapprove of me than acquaintances or friends for this, for this reason. Um, and I don't, I don't take that much to heart because I do think that it's quite understandable for lots of people to um, assume that gender medicine is um, a legitimate area of medicine and that it does bring benefits, because I cast my mind back to 2019 when I was talking to a paediatrician and a psychologist, both of whom were very worried about gender medicine. And one of the first questions I asked them was, well, are these treatments endorsed by medical societies? And they said, oh, yeah, pretty much all of the medical societies endorse these treatments. And so I asked them, well, how could that be so? I mean, you're telling me that these treatments are very poorly evidenced. How could it be that medical societies would endorse poorly evidenced treatments? I was quite sceptical. And I realised now I was just quite naive about um, the nature of medical societies and how they decide policy at a time of identity politics, on hot button issues. And I think, we've all seen prestigious journals, prestigious medical societies making claims that they must know are simply not supported by the evidence.
Why do you think that shift has happened? From your perspective, is it profit motive? Is it, people finding their careers are being elevated, getting glory, getting reputational honors? What do you think is behind all that corruption happening so fast and so severely?
Yes. Well, I think it's another way to look at it is to say that this is a civilizational issue. The issues involved in trans and biological reality and these medical interventions with children are part of some profound changes in institutions, um, attitudes, beliefs, norms across civilization. And it would be surprising if medical societies were exempted from this contagion. I mean, I had thought that it's very much a creature of, the great reawakening, the rise of identity politics, the social and psychological phenomena that Jonathan Haidt has referred to in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, the emergence of woke. Um, the Lancet, the UK medical journal, the Lancet, has run some quite, highly politicised articles about gender medicine, and so I had assumed that they too were a casualty of recent identity politics politicisation. But then just the other day, I read a very interesting article on Unheard, the website UNHERD, Unheard, and it, it was about the history of the Lancet going back quite some time, I think at least to the 19th century. And it seems that the Lancet was always highly politicised and a bit of a sort of a ratbag populist left campaigner. So that's interesting. But otherwise, I would have thought that this is all a relatively recent phenomenon, and I wonder if it's partly connected to the decline of organised religion, because I think there is a religious kind of tone to the gender-affirming way of life. And, it seems that we're not very good as humans at operating without some kind of grand philosophical or, existential system of belief. Communism arguably was a sort of, Christianity substitute. And I know that in the States, people ascribe the profit motive to much of what's happening with gender clinics. And I'm sure that the benefit to incomes is a factor in the spread of this medicine, but I think the profit motive alone doesn't explain what has happened, because my own impression of leading gender clinicians is that they are true believers, and that gender medicine is a combination of the profit motive and very emotionally powerful but bad ideas, coming out of queer theory, postmodernism, higher education, because,
Yeah.
as I say again, it's understandable that in the home of capitalism, they chant "follow the money," but in Australia, in the UK, gender medicine with kids has been driven mostly by the public sector and by modestly paid medical practitioners within the public sector. They don't get any bonus when their caseload explodes. It's true that I think there is the allure of the heroic life-saving doctor. That may be part of the motivation, but I suppose, from the outset, I've operated on the principle that unless there's good evidence to the contrary, you should assume that the people giving gender medicine do so in good faith, that they genuinely believe that it's beneficial. There might come a point where the evidence of harm is so overwhelming that it's difficult to sustain that belief in the good faith. But I think that I think it's unwise to rush to judgment, though, about to rush to judgment and to ascribe evil motives, bad motives to people.
That's a really interesting point you make about them being true believers, and kind of maybe this coming in as a sort of something to fill the void after the world has kind of left behind organized religion, or at least, our parts of the world. Do you think that there would be, bringing back faith for people in God? Do you think that that would make a difference? Do you think that people are lacking that in their lives and looking for a substitute form of meaning?
I guess so. That's just my armchair theory. Um, for my reporting, it doesn't really matter because I'm not getting involved in those sort of philosophical aspects. But I do think if you imagine the vast sweep of human history, and for so much of that time, it seems that pretty much every society had religious or philosophical beliefs. And we start to see the decline of organised religion in parts of the Western world. I suppose you can trace it back to the late 19th century, really accelerating after the Second World War. Um, then it's not so surprising. Um, the odd thing is that the United States was always a bit of an exception to that sociological theory that modernisation, science and technology, that the advance of those forces would inevitably create secularization and decline of traditional religion. I mean, that was a sort of a core theory um, in Western, developed societies, but the US always remained a much more religious country. And I wonder if the Dutch, of course, pioneered the gender medicine for um, children, um, but the American version of it, the sort of gender affirming rebadging of it, if you like, seems to be much more confident or aggressive, you could say. And I wonder if that reflects religious wellsprings in the United States. I don't know. I mean, in the UK, when you listen to the gender clinicians there, they don't sound the same as gender clinicians in the US. They sound a bit more. They sound a bit more medical. Um, but I was talking to someone in the Netherlands about what was driving the Dutch clinicians, and that person made the point to me that they're concentrated in a particular Dutch university, which I think um, used to be a Christian university. And this Dutch person was saying that he believed that the inheritance of the tradition of Dutch Christianity helped to explain why those Dutch clinicians were so concerned to relieve the distress of these young people in their bodies, that they entertained what are pretty extraordinary medical interventions as possible solutions. Yes, I think even when we emerge from this, I think that there's going to be a whole industry of PhDs written, about the trans movement and the gender medicine part of it. And I mean, another aspect of it is a political science question. This, if you look at even the more exaggerated figures for the proportion of trans people in the general population, it's a very, very small group. And yet it seems that the political and rights aims and the medical requests of this group secured agreement across all sorts of institutions, often with very poor arguments being marshalled in a very short period of time. It's quite unprecedented in the history of social movements, I would have thought. There's a lot to be written about how that was possible.
If and when it breaks, do you think that you might cover that type of topic, or
No,
would you?
I'm near the end of
No.
my career. I'm looking forward to
Oh, really?
retiring. Yeah.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
my hope is to see this topic become a normal journalistic topic. If it looks like a medical scandal, report it as a medical scandal. So instead of having a sort of politicised frame in which you blur questions of evidence and harm. And I think, we're starting to see that correction in the US, but the previous failure of the media has been so comprehensive that there would still be many, many normies, people in mainstream America, people in mainstream Australia, Canada, New Zealand, who know virtually nothing about these medical treatments. It's first of all, they have to learn about what exactly is done to trans kids in these gender clinics. What exactly happens? And my experience, at social gatherings, when people have asked me what I'm writing about, and I start talking about these gender medical treatments, I've often got the response, "No, you're making it up. That can't happen. That would be against the law. Under 18, you can't do that." And we had a federal election campaign here. Seems like a long time ago, but I think it was only last year. And gender medicine became briefly an issue in that political campaign because there was one candidate, Catherine Deves, who was standing as an independent. She was standing as a Liberal candidate, so this is a centre-right group. And she, before she was an endorsed candidate, she's gender-critical feminist, and she was horrified by gender clinic treatments, and she had a social media history of making strongly expressed comments about gender medicine. And, someone had dredged up all those comments and the trans activists were recirculating them because they felt that those comments would damage her campaign because she had talked about, chemical castration and mutilation. And the Prime Minister, who was from the same party, Scott Morrison, he's a Liberal, so centre-right, was asked about this candidate and her concerns, and the Prime Minister said that, he felt there were serious questions about these gender medical interventions. And there's an extraordinary scene which was captured on camera of a number of the political journalists who follow the Prime Minister around berating him and telling him that under Australian law, it's simply not possible to carry out transgender surgery under 18. And the Prime Minister was clearly not well briefed because he buckled. And we had very prominent journalists here in Australia making this statement that there's no such thing as under 18 trans surgery, when in fact it's on the record. The exact scale of it we don't know, but there's no doubt whatsoever that under 18 trans surgery in the form of mastectomy has been happening, and it probably goes back at least until about 2015, 2016. And we know it because there was a period before the trans exception applied and this constraint was removed. But it used to be that for any of these medical interventions, gender medical interventions with kids under 18, they had to go and get it approved by a family court judge. And so that's why we have it, in the court records of these operations. And there were several, I think, over a period of some years. So I suspect there's more. In fact, I know there's more. It's a matter of analysing the data properly. So I'm not sure how we got down that route, but we're talking about the political science and the question of how this movement has been able to control the narrative so successfully. And, as I say, a large part of that, huge part of that is the failure of the media, because if there was robust media reporting and commentary on this, including, in Australia's case, our public broadcaster, the ABC, then it would have been much harder to capture all of these other institutions, including, education institutions, the political class, bureaucrats, the medical societies. It would have been much harder. And to roll that back is going to be, I think, very difficult. I mean, I'm sure you will have seen statements online that as soon as the litigation starts over gender medicine, as soon as the mainstream finds out what gender medicine actually involves, there will be such a reaction of horror from the mainstream that it may well overreach and affect gays and lesbians and adult transsexuals, who are among the people trying to raise the alarm about gender medicine. But the point I'm making here is that that litigation is not some automatic solution to this. Litigation has started in a number of countries, but it's a rather slow process. I guess in the States you have the Republican states prohibiting gender medicine, but again, that's a sort of a one-step forward, two-step back process, depending on which judge hears the challenge as to whether or not there's an injunction preventing that prohibition going ahead. But it's the process of informing the public about what happens in gender medicine, about the risks of it, and then about the wider question of gender ideology and its corruption of institutions. That's a huge job of corrective journalism and public communication. And it requires a lot of people in power to admit, if only to themselves, that they've got it wrong, that they've been misled, that they've been misleading others. And what's that going to look like? Will there be many people who just quietly adopt the new informed position and hope there's no excavation of their past conduct or their institution's past approval of policies that had no foundation in truth or science? I think it's going to be a very messy unravelling. And I guess one of the possibilities is that gender ideology is just so well entrenched now that it may not be able to be removed for a generation. I don't think anyone really knows.
Yeah, especially, excuse me, considering what's being taught in the schools and how young people are being indoctrinated into believing kind of both the tenets of gender ideology, but also the lie that this is not really happening. In a sense, like you said, people will just deny. Like here in the U.S., we have Chase Strangio, the most famous lawyer from the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, and Chase is a trans man, so, a woman who identifies as a man. And Chase has gone out there and said, no, these surgery, like, there are no trans surgeries being done on minors when there have been, the New York Times has printed, that double mastectomies have been done on 13-year-olds.
Yes,
And as I said, there was a study that showed that penile inversion has been done on boys as young as 15 in the US. So it definitely is happening. The second example I mentioned is more rare than the double mastectomies, which is happening much more frequently, which is very frightening. Um, but yeah, as you said, this could be something that takes a long time to break, considering how much it's been entrenched in the institutions and how much the younger generations are kind of, as you said, becoming true believers, which
mm,
is really a sort of a chilling way to think about it. But I think you make a really good point there, which is that people really are true believers, because it makes me think about how can people support something that, I guess, to people like us is so clearly an atrocity, but it's because they have this righteousness that can justify things that would otherwise be wrong, I guess. So it when you say it's almost this religious like belief, that strikes true, because that could be a very good explanation for how they justify a lot of this stuff, and how they justify shutting people down as well, because really anything goes. If you disagree with them, you are a heretic. You are someone who can just be unpersoned, really.
yes, yes. I think that part of the problem is the nature of teacher education in the Western world. Um, no doubt with good intentions. Many teachers seem to be being taught that their job is a form of activism, progressive activism, social justice activism, and that primes them to be well disposed towards gender ideology, which is represented as progressive, as opposed to the bigoted, reactionary gender binary. Because otherwise, it seems rather strange that a form of lifelong medicalisation, which enriches large pharmaceutical companies, is somehow a progressive project. But it does fit within that general template of social justice activism, and that is spread um, by sort of primary school level slogans. And that seems to be the level at which some teachers operate. I mean, I've met teachers who clearly have very little understanding of the detail of this topic, but who just try to shut people down with the slogans. Um, I have met teachers who are very worried about this, but they feel quite isolated. And I think that their fears for their careers are, quite justified. But the situation in the schools is absolutely central, because in many jurisdictions now, the schools are being set up to prime the children to consider what their gender identity is, that it might not relate to their body, um, and that they might undergo various treatments, such as puberty blockers, which are represented as a sort of a fun, cartoonish thing in a lot of the materials to kids, and quite young kids are being exposed also to cartoonish indoctrination about top surgery, mastectomy, with, again, these cartoonish figures with scars. And so that ideology and the setting up of schools to enable social transition, sometimes without parental improvement, parental involvement or approval, that is all, that's sort of massing children at the entry to a lifelong medicalised pathway. And obviously not all of them will go down it, but the kids who go down it are probably going to be the most vulnerable, with all sorts of other mental health conditions, or they're autistic, same-sex attracted but awkward about it, have suffered shame in relation to it. And so I think that even when you get the mainstream to understand that gender medicine is a problem, there's this extra effort to try to understand the way in which the school system is acting as a kind of a conveyor belt towards the gender clinics. So, it really is a very difficult and widespread problem in society.
Yeah, it's a bleak picture, it's frightening. Which is all the more reason why, I appreciate your work and your tireless coverage of this. And we've gone a little over time here, so I don't want to take up too
Okay.
much more of your time, but I just want to tell everyone listening, please go follow Bernard Lane on Substack, on Twitter. His work is really important in exposing this gender industry. And so, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Sasha. Nice to talk to you.